Hi, today we're going to talk about in this video module the 5 stages of growth that every company goes through as it matures and gets bigger. What you're going to learn in this video is how and what must shift in a company as it grows. Now, each of these stages and each of these gear shifts has its own checklist and much more detailed and elaborate things, and we're going to do separate videos on each gear shift, but this will give you the overall context, kind of the 5,000 or 10,000 foot view of the things to be aware of. Some of these are things you don't know that have to change as an organization grows. How the management style has to change, how the systems have to change, and how you adjust many things in the business. Many businesses will reach a certain level and go sideways for a long time because the founders or the managers take the proof of their small scale success and use that as an excuse or a reason to keep doing things the same way. And the reality is you have to change at certain stages of a company as it grows and adds additional levels of people and management and scale. So, everyone understands that a startup company is enormously different than an IBM. But we don't have a standard for how many stages there are. And that's one of the reasons I founded this business, is we don't even have a language, because some of the recommendations that come in books and authors and experts are watered down for the mass market. And they could be great advice for stage 3 and deadly advice for stage 1, or vice versa. So anytime you're reading a book, whether it's about marketing or management or leadership, you've got to think, how does that apply to your stage of the business? Because the philosophies and the systems and the time frames and so many things are different. The VP of marketing job at IBM is a very different job than the VP of marketing at a startup. And if you were to take that IBM VP and put them in a startup, they'd fail. And if you would take that startup VP and put them in IBM, they would probably fail too, because the jobs are so very different. So I want to tell you a little bit of a story about a company that shall remain nameless, where I was hired as an interim CEO to come in and adjust that company. And what I found is this company was part of an incubator, and what I found is that the company was acting as a big company, even though it was a small company. And this prevented it from being successful. This was sort of a restart. The company had invested and spent $4 million of a $5 million venture capital investment already the day I showed up. And it turned out had spent a little more than that. And they basically had paid a $30,000 fee to find me as an interim CEO to a headhunter, even though I had sent my resume to one of the partners there. So they were in such a mode of doing things in a big company way that it was wasting a lot of time and a lot of money. I was interviewed by an HR person, and not only was that sort of insulting, but there was nothing that person could ever do to validate my skills as a CEO, because they were an HR person. They didn't have the skills themselves. And you got to realize you can't recognize skills and interview for skills that you yourself don't have. So on the day I started, they made me an offer. We worked through the contract and whatever. And the day I started, I sat down with the same HR person, and she handed me a form and said, here's the form we have to fill out to hire someone, and it requires 5 signatures. Well, I immediately took that and ripped it in half and handed it back to her and said, now it only requires 1 signature to hire someone, and that's mine. So this company had actually, it was a spin-off. Some of the people had come from a big company, a big computer company that was no longer around, and they had adopted many of the policies and procedures that had come from that big company. And that's the worst possible thing you could ever do in a startup. So I spent the next 5 or 6 months making very significant changes, not only in the company, but also trying to encourage a lot of change in the incubator as a whole, to get away from those big company practices and processes that are very slow and lumbering and completely inappropriate. And the other thing that contributed to them having this big company style and attitude was they were also investing in biotech. And when you're investing in biotech, it's almost like a big company, because you might spend 10, 20, $30 million in research over 5 years before you have a product. And so that's obviously very different than an IT company, which this was, that needs to launch and have a product in 6 to 18 months of a development cycle. And so we made a lot of changes, but that's one of the reasons that I decided to start this company. Was I realized how few people knew how to shift gears from a small company, a startup mode, to the next phase and the next phase. And so we've developed this model to help create a smooth transition through these 5 stages of company growth, so that you have a reference of what you should be doing when in this development of your company. So first, let's define a small business. The SBA, Small Business Administration, defines a small company as under 100 employees, a medium company as 100 to 1,000, and then over 1,000 as a large company. Well, it turns out that definition, most people don't know it in the first place, but in the second place, it's very impractical, because all 5 of these shifts have to happen in that 1 to 50 or 1 to 100 company, 100 person employees. So we don't want to use the term small business in the way the Small Business Administration does, because all of these gear shifts have to happen. The first one happens at about 7 people, the second one happens at about 15 people, and the third one, going into a stage 4, is, depending on the business, it's going to vary between 30 employees and 50 employees. And so those stages of development, and we'll show you a diagram of that momentarily, is really what we're talking about, understanding and having a context for when those changes have to happen. Generally, larger companies got that way by doing a decent job of figuring these things out, but most of them did it painstakingly by trial and error over many, many years. You can't start as a mature company, and as a matter of fact, in the 1990s, when a lot of companies were getting easy funding for the internet, they often took big company executives like vice presidents from Sun and dropped them into a startup. And what they did was not birth the baby. They didn't go through the pregnancy and the figuring out and the iteration. They built what they were used to having at their big company because they had a lot of money, and they thought they knew what they needed. But the reality is, any new company has a lot of learning going through that birthing process of a new product and a launch into the marketplace. So you can't take big company people and put them in a startup and expect them to be successful any more than you could do the opposite. Big company systems are usually way too much overhead for startups. They don't adjust quickly enough. They don't take advantage of speed. They don't have, what are called the skunk works philosophies for rapid product development and testing and learning. And a startup company is in the business of trying things and failing rapidly and cheaply until it figures out what works and homes in on the right thing. So all of these principles will apply and can be used in any business, because when you're doing intrapreneurship, what happens is you're going to have a lot of new product development using the small company principles, even though the company as a whole might be using the big company or medium-sized company principles. So a good metaphor here is, think about the job of the captain steering this cabin cruiser or small yacht versus the job of the captain that's running that aircraft carrier. You can't have those people change places and expect that to work and be smooth. It took many, many years of learning and having all kinds of different management levels, specialization of people, the org chart, the job descriptions, all the things that are coordinating on this ship that might have 5,000 people on it. Very different job, even though we both call them captain. same thing for any title you want to put on almost anyone, unless they're an individual contributor that's very specialized, a professional doing a very narrow thing. When you're in management, the shift in company size is a really big deal. So we're going to drill down now and talk about how each of these, here's a chart that shows the evolution. And if we can think of a startup as a small speedboat, you can launch quickly, you can change direction quickly, you don't need a lot of planning, you're very fast. That's a good metaphor for a startup. But as soon as you launch and you have customers, what we call stage 2, the early revenue stage, you suddenly have customers you have to support. And changing your product gets a little harder because of those legacy issues with your customers and your old customers. Once you get to stage 3, when you've really refined your model, you have your profit plan down, hopefully you've documented your systems, your processes, you've formed a culture and a brand that starts to change less rapidly. So that's a stage 3 company. Stage 4 is what I call normally the rapid growth stage, and at that point it takes more time and planning. You're stretching the planning horizons, the amount of capital you're risking and raising, all kinds of things that we'll list shortly for that stage. And we don't talk at Airtight Management much about mature companies because we're all about making these shifts here. And once you get to here, things get easier. You can afford to make mistakes. You've established yourself. You've worked out most of the processes and systems and what a job description is, who can do it, all those things that are risky in the early stages of a business. So this is what I call the stage of development model. And a raw startup is stage 1. It's red because it's risky, it's rapidly changing. Stage 2 is early revenue. So you've got your first few customers. Technically, the definition of a startup is no revenue, but most people don't use that definition. Usually you're called a startup until you've proven your business model or traction and you can hang around, which is late stage 2 or early stage 3 typically. So stage 2 early revenue is, might be these numbers are soft. It will vary a lot whether you're a distributor or a manufacturer or what industry you're in. These things can vary. So these numbers are not hard, they're soft, but they're typical ranges. In early revenue, you would typically be between 5 and 100 employees. 100 would only be if you had a big financing and were launching, something pretty elaborate and large. Established is, and this is the riskiest 2 shifts in gears, is this stage and this stage, because this is moving from product development to sales and marketing being the critical success factor. And then the third is really about management and organization. And we'll talk a lot more about this in this video and in a whole other series of videos in the Performance Accountability and Merit System Airtight System 2 series of videos. This is just the introduction to these stages and what they are, and we have a separate video on each of these gear shifts and what's going to happen at each of them. So the next slide is, so what has to change? I mean, this is the real question. What do you have to know to get ready to change and plan? Because somewhere between 7 and 12 employees, you have to make a major gear shift. You have to introduce now a reorganization, a management structure that's different than when you were 5 employees or 7 employees. Typically, when you double that up again, between 12 and 25, 30 employees, you're now introducing a second level of management. So now you got a CEO, a manager, and not just individual contributors, but probably some supervisors and management people in various areas of the business. And by the time you reach 50 employees, that's actually at the point of the last major shift, because now you're going to a CEO and board of directors, an executive team of very experienced people, and then a bunch of managers and the individual contributors under those. And that's getting more like the aircraft carrier in terms of having some necessary bureaucracy and communications and processes and those sorts of things very refined. So what we're going to do is give you in the coming videos lists of each of the things you have to look at and why, and a spectrum to look at. But here's a sample for a startup. What should be the startup culture and the startup philosophy? You want to have a vision for what that is. And typically, it's fast, it's lean, it's be very open to adjusting and changing things quickly. It's very limited bureaucracy. You can shift, you can have a conversation at the water cooler and make a major strategic change potentially, or at least some significant changes on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis as you learn more. You've got to have minimum bureaucracy so you can have that rapid changing and steering. You're not investing in things that you can't adjust for. You've got to do things cheaply. You've got to hire just in time. You've got to look for 80% solutions, and obviously, they're usually much, much cheaper and quicker than a big company would do. That's one of the advantages of being a young, new company, and you've got to leverage that to compete with the bigger companies that some customers are going to feel more comfortable with because they've been around for so much longer. We might literally do something at 1/10 the cost in a startup that a big company would spend to do the same thing. But they can't risk their brand. They've got to be much more careful doing these things. They can't do as much trial and error without hurting their legacy customers and their brand. So you really want to use that as a startup as a competitive advantage against everyone else that's already in the marketplace to enter that market. You've got to be willing to take big risks in a startup. You've got to not, take advantage of the fact you don't have legacy issues and customers. And Jim Collins, in his book Built to Last, I think it is, uses the analogy: use bullets instead of cannonballs. In other words, fire a lot of small bullets that don't cost a lot. And when you see you're hitting the target because something's happening, then you go back and you load the cannonballs and you start doubling up and making bigger investments in getting things done. So that's what a startup really needs to feel like. And it probably won't be very successful if it's not doing that, unless you're a biotech company and you're looking at a market window of 5 or 8 years to enter that market. These are the philosophies that you have to have. I've always found the Lockheed Martin Skunk Works is a great example of lean, rapid development. This airplane, I do a whole case study on it in my product development video, was developed in about 1/3 of the time and about 1/5 of the cost of the typical airplane development project at the time in the 60s. But in fact, it led the world and this whole space for over 30 years, being the superior product in that space. So it's a great story, and Lockheed Martin Skunk Works in development, sometimes they call it agile management, where you're trying things very rapidly and getting feedback and adjusting constantly. It's a great metaphor for a startup. So let's talk about style of management. Now, there are many categories you could name on several dimensions of management, but one of the big dimensions is, are you dictatorial or are you collaborative or consensus building, or the other end of the spectrum? As a small company, it's actually a good thing to be dictatorial. The vision is in the mind of the entrepreneur founder and hopefully some of the senior management team. And so you need rapid decisions and you need firmness in what we're trying. And of course you need to be flexible to what's coming in from the marketplace. But as you develop as a company, you have to become more collaborative because there's more and more to know, there's more customers, there's more disciplines that are important, and things get complicated as the company gets bigger, so you need more input and validation from a team. So you'll find collaborative managers can be a failure in a startup situation because it's too much overhead, it's too slow, and you'll find that managers who are dictatorial in a more mature company will also fail or potentially freeze and not be able to grow that company because they often have control issues. They're in the habit of making all the decisions and they don't shift gears to developing their managers and their people to make those decisions. So obviously this is a spectrum, but as you move from stage 1 into stage 2 and 3, you need to add more collaboration and project management and having more meetings for people to communicate, to facilitate that, because there's too much going on for any one person, even the CEO, to communicate everything that needs to be communicated. So you need structure for strategic planning, monthly and quarterly management meetings, and oftentimes weekly management meetings, although they might be in a particular area of the business. So that's one spectrum you really have to think a lot about. And because this can be a personality style, it takes a lot of self-control to step back and say, how am I going to stop being dictatorial if that's my natural management style? Or how am I going to start being more collaborative? So you really have to spend time thinking about and have the self-discipline and self-control to force these things as the company matures. So the next slide, the focus in a new product launch or a new company launch changes radically with each of these stages. In raw startup, the development stage is the product development stage, okay? You've got to be obsessive and dictatorial and detail-oriented on what that product's going to look like, who's the ideal customer, validating that product vision against the marketplace and that customer. But as soon as you launch that product and it's set, granted there'll be new versions, improvements, but as soon as you launch that customer, the challenge that people look to managers and CEOs for is the sales and marketing. Now your problem is less product development, and the management and leadership focus has to switch to the sales and marketing. And in stage 3, it tends to be all about professional management. You've figured out your sales and marketing formula. Granted, optimization will happen and things will improve and new products will come along probably, and services. But the focus in establishing that business and locking, cementing it to live forever and to be profitable is now instilling in that business professional management practices, documentation, the right amount, I'm not saying a lot of bureaucracy, but the right amount of bureaucracy for a small company. Remember, this is probably a 1 to 5 person company. This is now getting to, you've added a sales team and a marketing team potentially, or some people or distribution that you've outsourced. So you've got more to manage here. By the time you get to here, you're probably 12, 15, 20 employees in a typical, at least a high-tech venture. Different industries will vary, but you've got to focus on that. And then in the 4th stage of development, when you have your management systems, your training, your hiring, and know how to hire and keep and train people well to do more of what you are doing, the focus tends to be on increasing distribution, doing deals, strategic decisions, visibility, becoming a thought leader in the marketplace so that people will come to you first to build your brand, those sorts of things. So most of the risk is here, because by the time you're here, you have profits to pay for things, and you can typically afford the consulting and the experts and bringing in the full-time people that you need, because by the time you get here, you're already successful and you've cemented your place in the world because you've got a profitable formula, assuming the world doesn't change dramatically. So the success characteristics at each stage are important to look at, because the same personality attributes, like I said, dictatorial, paranoid, distrustful, control freak, they can be seen as a good thing in MM stands for micromanagement, in a very early stage company. But if you take those same characteristics and overlay them in an executive in a stage 3 or a stage 4 company, those things can be deadly. Now, there are exceptions. If you've read Steve Jobs' biography, you'll see that he's obsessive about product development. But he shifts his product development to being obsessive about marketing as that product is going to launch, and then he goes back to the next product while the other staff does the operations, the rollout, manufacturing, and everything else. So he tends to be obsessive about these things, and it's a great read. I'd recommend reading that book, because it is an example of some of the beauty and the success of Apple, as well as of some of its limitations that might not work in other industries as well. So in stage 2, you want those kind of fanatical, obsessive, dictatorial personality traits. In stage 2, as you add management and more focus on marketing and sales, you've really got to be thinking very differently, because the sales personality is different than the product development personality. And then at stage 3, now we're talking about professional management, bringing in the gray hair, sometimes they call it the window dressing for an IPO if it's a venture-backed company, to be bringing in the people that know how to run a bigger company. And some entrepreneurs can't make that transition. Some managers, some individuals can't make that transition. They just prefer to live in the early stage, rapid change, rapid risk evolution phase of the business. And in stage 4, it's very important to have a mature leader who is a face inside and or outside the company, and is the brand and culture controller of that company. Next slide. So what should you watch next? This gives you the framework and the language to talk about the shifts in stages as a company matures. But there's an enormous number of changes. These are just a few examples. We've given you in the handout a bunch of reference sheets to help you track where you are today, and some checklists about what you would need to be able to make those gear shifts. I do recommend you seek out help, even if it's having lunch with friends. I mean, ideally you should bring in a coach or a consultant who has that experience and has been there and done that before, because it will save a lot of pain and a lot of blood, that you don't have to learn all those lessons all over again. So somewhere between 5 and 7, the management team should be thinking about how to make that gear shift. And at about 20 or 25 people to make another gear shift, use a coach, use a consultant when you can that specializes in this kind of area of business development. The second lesson to take away from this really is that management skills are not intuitive from experience if you're in the wrong stage. Management is an art much more than a science. And if you don't spend time in that stage of development, at least several years, you're probably not going to be good at determining what the changes are that need to happen in the evolution in their companies. So people that spend their whole career in a large company or a medium-sized company or a startup often can't make the shift. And I think it's very important. We do a whole module called the skill set matrix, which is about interviewing people and taking the stage of development they work at into account. I think this is the number one hiring mistake in corporate America today, is not taking into account the size and scope of that person's role and his previous things on the resume or previous things before they're coming into your company. And another lesson to take away from this is the transition from one stage to another is a dangerous thing. It requires thought and guidance and analysis, and really stepping back and what Michael Gerber calls working on the business instead of in the business. If you feel overwhelmed, if you feel you're not in control of your business, that's why our tagline for Airtight Management is take control of your business. Because most people that come to us feel they've lost control of their business and they don't know what to do next. Their business is running them instead of them running their business. So it's very important to think about, are you at one of those transition stages between a stage 2 and 3 or a stage 3 and 4? So the next modules to watch would be a video on each of these shifts, depending on where you are. 1 to 2 or 2 to 3 or 3 to 4 will be 3 separate videos. You should definitely think about the video called Management by Objective, which was created by one of the fathers of management, Peter Drucker, and it's been proven to increase the value creation in organizations by about 56% when it's done right. The caveat is most organizations don't do it right. It has to have structure and it has to stay the same in how you do it. The third one I would recommend is the Dashboard Basics, which preps your business to get ready to go to stage 3 and hopefully be ready for stage 4. And a lot of companies don't have their metrics down, and I come in and they're a tour company, sometimes with 100 employees, and they really can't answer basic questions about the economics and the metrics of their business. And the last video I'd recommend as a next thing to put on your list is the strategic planning process, whether you're a small company or a big company. So that's it for today on Stages of Growth. It's just a taste of the things that you have to think about as your company grows, get help, read books, get a coach, and definitely watch those other videos that I've recommended as a next step. Bye-bye.